The moment finally came where independent senator from Vermont, Bernie Sanders, was pressured on whether he supports a ceasefire in Gaza. Here's what he had to say.
Your fellow progressives say that there should be a full-on ceasefire, which would require an agreement on both sides to halt the fighting. Do you support a ceasefire? And if not, why not?
Well, I don't know how you can have a ceasefire, permanent ceasefire, with an organization like Hamas, which is dedicated to turmoil and chaos and destroying the state of Israel. And I think what the Arab countries in the region understand, that Hamas has got to go.
The Israel Defense Forces confirmed its fighter jets launched and hit 450 Hamas targets in Gaza over the last 24 hours. They say including Hamas command centers, observation posts, and anti-tank guided missile launch positions. The strikes continue even as the IDF continues to press forward with its ground operation. An IDF spokesman has confirmed that they have Gaza City encircled. Per the Palestinian Health Ministry, over 10,000 Gazans have been killed in the month of fighting since October 7th.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken is still in the Middle East. He says the Biden administration is doing everything it can to prevent the conflict from spilling over into the larger region.
Do you feel that you accomplished the mission you set out on this trip?
All of this is a work in progress. Look, we know the deep concern here for the terrible toll that Gaza is taking on Palestinians, on men, women, and children in Gaza, innocent civilians. A concern that we share and that we're working on every single day. We've engaged the Israelis on steps that they can take to minimize civilian casualties. We're working, as I said, very aggressively on getting more humanitarian assistance into Gaza, and we have very concrete ways of doing that, and I think you'll see in the days ahead.
So he was in Turkey. He actually met with Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank. He went to Iraq, etc., to try to reassure basically Arab partner governments that the U.S. is doing everything it can to exert some influence over Israel to minimize the civilian casualties. Of course, there's no evidence really that that's working. 10,000 deaths at this point, and the Israeli government seems as committed as ever to basically the position that this war is going to continue until Hamas is totally obliterated. Biden, it's not clear whether we accept that that's going to be the case, and we're going to reach a cutoff point with them where we say, if you're just continuing to do this, we're not going to fund you anymore. So far, it's they get whatever they want, and then they do whatever they want, and we're not actually exerting any real pressure over them.
Yeah, there have been a number of historical data points that people have pointed to make the argument that Joe Biden, his administration, Americans on a bipartisan basis in Congress don't actually want to stop the bombardment. One of the data points people point to is a moment, I think back in 2014, when Joe Biden was VP, where he was sent to Israel to persuade Bibi Netanyahu to stop the bombing at that time, and successfully was able to do so. Reporting that's come out of the State Department where the Biden administration is agitating not to stop the bombing so much as to give humanitarian pauses that give the U.S. more credibility, as it publicly says it wants to minimize civilian casualties, but privately is giving Israel the green light to do what it wants. It just wants the kind of optics cover that a pause would provide. You see this really bizarre wordsmithing around the term ceasefire. You heard Bernie Sanders just then inject the word permanent before it. A ceasefire can be as temporary or long as anybody decides it to be, but in terms of by the terms of the negotiation.
Well, I mean, but a temporary ceasefire is essentially what Biden is called for. Then, if you're going to that,
the whole point is that it provokes a negotiation that says it calls Israel to the table to articulate whether or not it is in fact being discreet with its targets and doing what it says it's doing in terms of minimizing humanitarian harms. Over the weekend, it bombed multiple hospitals, more UN schools, the last remaining water sources. It's been targeting the solar power and any independent way to generate electricity in Gaza. There was reporting earlier in the last week, earlier in the weekend, that some Gazans had used fishing boats to catch a small number of fish to help sustain them in this enormous caloric deficit they're under. And the next day, the IDF bombed all of those fishing boats along the coast. How much more evidence do you need that what is being done is a collective punishment on all the people of Gaza? Not even to mention all the statements that have been made by various IDF and Israeli politicos that speak to the idea that there is a plan to raise Gaza to the ground. There's no distinction between Gazans, between Hamas and Palestinians, et cetera, et cetera. So at a certain point, you have to ask the question. Now, there have been ceasefires in the past that have lasted a short period of time, that lasted a long period of time, that Hamas has broken, that Israel has broken. But the narrative that's coming out now is something along the lines of you cannot, and you heard this a little bit from Bernie, which was why so many leftists were frustrated with him over the weekend. You cannot trust Hamas in particular. They are not people who can be trusted. They're not people who would respect international law. They're the ones that preclude us from having a ceasefire. At the same time, when you're seeing an enormous violation of international law from Israel, I don't see any indication that Israel, which is flagrantly committing war crimes in front of the national stage, is more or less likely to respect the terms of a ceasefire than Hamas.
Right. This is why there's not going to be a ceasefire. Israel doesn't want a ceasefire. They want to wipe out Hamas. They don't want to negotiate with Hamas. They want to destroy Hamas. And Hamas maybe at this moment wants a ceasefire because they're being carpet bombed, but will probably continue hostilities at some point in the future. So this is just going to continue. My point is then the U.S. should exit the arrangement, should stop funding anyone involved, and should say, good luck, and we're going to mind our own business and our own borders. And you've brought up a couple times the idea that there's a lot of American support for a ceasefire based on that poll. I did finally look at that poll itself. So there's only one poll on this issue. It's for Data for Progress, which is a liberal or progressive group. And here's the here's the phrasing in the polling.
It's the Sean McElway group.
But he got forced out of it.
He did.
Yeah. Here was the statement. The U.S. should call for a ceasefire and a de-escalation of violence in Gaza. The U.S. should leverage its close diplomatic relationship with Israel to prevent further violence and civilian deaths. So that's all lumped together. And so there is 66% support for that. 30% strongly agree, 36% somewhat agree. And then if you break it down, Democrats, it's very in favor of that. Republicans, more mixed. But I wonder if, this is just an open question, I wonder if you just polled the first part, the U.S. should call for a ceasefire by itself. Or do you support a ceasefire? I wonder if that would be different, because they lumped things, I think, in with the ceasefire. And I'm not saying that necessarily people would be against it, but they lumped other things that I think are even less controversial, like a de-escalation of violence, to prevent further. That second part, the U.S. should leverage its relationship to prevent further violence and civilian deaths. That's not even, they're not even in that clause saying specifically in Gaza, just in general. I wonder how you would poll the ceasefire question by itself.
I'm inclined to think that most people who are looking at the images that are coming out of Gaza wanted to stop. And that's what that ceasefire poll is reflecting. They wanted to stop. They see Israel has now killed more civilians in Gaza in the last 30 days than Russia has killed in the entire war with Ukraine. 30 days more civilians than in the entire almost 2 years now of the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Wait, can you say that again?
Israel has killed more civilians in Gaza.
Yeah. The casualty numbers, we don't have exact numbers, but they're well over 10,000 on both sides of Russia-Ukraine.
And that is even given that Ukraine is 20 times larger than Gaza. So the giving you...
there are way more overall deaths. You're saying civilians.
Civilians. Israel has killed more civilians in Gaza in 30 days than Russia has in the entire war in Ukraine, which began over 600 days ago. The average Palestinian is now living on 2 pieces of bread a day. And we're seeing, again, that the IDF intentionally has been bombing bakeries, fishing boats, any other means to get sustenance. I have seen, I can't even begin to express, I've seen so many videos of kids. I looked into the cranial cavity of a kid in a video that Trita Parsi tweeted out last night, and looked into the hole where their brain once was. Americans are seeing these kind of images, and it's why you get, by some reports, 100,000, by some reports up to 300,000. There's very little mainstream reporting on it. But people participating in the pro-Palestinian protests here in D.C. over the weekend, and of course, all over the country. And of course, as we discussed at length, you see Joe Biden's electoral chances really struggling in many states, including those like Michigan, where he once got an overwhelming majority of the Arab American vote, and now only 17% said that they would be willing to vote for him. And I don't think that's a number. I think there's been reporting that the Democratic Party thinks that number is going to bounce back closer to the election. But hearing the conviction and the voices of at least Arab Americans, I don't know about some of these other wavering constituency groups, I'm skeptical that they're ever going to get back on board, given what we've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I think Biden could do himself and U.S. policy and our national security situation a lot of good by disentangling ourselves from costly foreign interventions like Ukraine and certainly like Israel. I don't think there's going to be a ceasefire because I don't think the Israeli government doesn't want a ceasefire. They don't want to negotiate with Hamas, and Hamas would probably, neither side would respect a ceasefire for an extended period of time. They're in open conflict, and that's what you have right now. You have a war between these two groups.
Well, in fact, we have an escalation. The United States just signaled, and this is interesting because normally they don't like to advertise the location of nuclear-capable submarines, but they just signaled publicly that they have sent one to the Middle East, along with a number of troops on the ground. There's been, obviously, we've been discussing the fact that there are U.S. troops in the region, that in countries that have been now implicated by this conflict, and what will happen if U.S. troops start to die because of bombs that are now flying pretty freely across the region. You know, there's so many layers to the frustration with what's happening here. We as we reported last week, you have senior members of the UN and the State Department issuing their resignations because they don't think that they can ethically perform their duties, and they feel like they need to say and do something, that this is so out of the bounds of what we normally see in terms of our foreign policy. Our already disastrous and historically bad foreign policy, even this is shocking the conscience of people who work at the State Department. And I don't know, I'm just not as skeptical of those polls. If anything, I think a week or two later, given the images that we've seen, it's only going to get worse for the administration that's backing this kind of brutality.
We'll have more Rising right after this.